Would you pray with me? Awaken us, God, with your truth and your love for the world and everything in it. Open our minds and our hearts for the word you have for us today, and give us faith to trust you with our lives. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. In 2018, I was fortunate enough to receive a grant that allowed me to take a 3-month sabbatical. With the backing of the congregation where I was the senior minister at the time, I got to travel extensively and do things which I might never have the opportunity to do again. Prior to receiving the grant, I, along with a committee in the church, had to write a proposal, of course, and one of the questions that those who offered the grant suggested that I answer was, what makes your heart sing? I think another way of saying this is, what are your passions? In a real way, this is what Jesus tells us today when he says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If we think about our greatest passions, that is probably what we give our time and energy and our lives to. How do we spend the days of our lives? What gets our very best? And whatever gets our time and our very best, those are our priorities. In our reading today from Luke, Jesus seems to be saying that if our primary allegiance is to money and possessions, then we are missing the boat. Last Sunday, in our reading from Luke, Jesus counseled against wealth and greed. And here we are again with this reading today, with Jesus saying a similar thing, at least it seems so, because the context once again relates to possessions. We ought to take Jesus' admonition seriously against attachment to money and possessions, since he mentioned it last week and mentions it this week and mentions it throughout the Gospels, and particularly in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is saying that if one of our greatest passions, or perhaps our number one passion, is money and possessions, then our heart is traveling along right behind that passion. But I think Jesus would agree with me, believe it or not, that it's not just our allegiance to money and things that can get out of whack. There are a long list of things that can. This can happen with work. If we are still working and we haven't retired, it could be that we aren't giving as much of ourselves as we ought to our work. But it can be equally true that we can overdo it. You probably have heard, it's been around for a long time, the saying that no one has ever said on their deathbed that they wish they had spent more time at the office. What should be our priorities then? Work should be one. Family, friends. I've told you before about one of my favorite poets, Barbara Crooker. I used one of her poems as words for meditation one Sunday. I had the privilege of meeting her when I was on my sabbatical, and we had a lengthy conversation. Among her poems, one of my favorites is titled Ordinary Life. Now, at first, you may wonder what in the world I see in this poem, what does it have to do with priorities, our treasure? But listen to the words, and I'll explain why I think that they are. This is a day when nothing happened. The children went off to school without a murmur, remembering their books, lunches, gloves. All morning, the baby and I built block stacks in the squares of light on the floor. And lunch blended into nap time. I cleaned out kitchen cupboards, one of those jobs that never gets done. Then I sat in a circle of sunlight and drank ginger tea Watch the birds at the feeder jostle over lunch's little scraps. A pheasant strutted from the hedgerow, preened and flashed his jeweled head. Now chicken roasts in the pan, and the children return, the murmur of their stories dappling the air. I peel carrots and potatoes without paring my thumb. We listen together for your wheels on the drive, grace before bread, and at the table, actual conversation, no bickering or pokes. And then the drift into homework. Baby goes to his cars, drives them along the sofa's ridges and hills. Leaning by the counter, we steal a long, slow kiss, tasting of coffee and cream. The chickens diminish to skin and a skeleton, the moon to a comma, a sliver of white. But this has been a day of grace in the dead of winter, the hard, cold knuckle of the year, a day that unwrapped itself like an unexpected gift, and the stars turn on, order themselves into the winter night. As the title of the poem indicates, Barbara is describing an ordinary day in her life and her family's life. As you heard near the end of the poem, she says this has been a day of grace. And then she says that the day unwrapped itself like an unexpected gift. What do I see in these words that have to do with priorities? Given the conversation that I had with Barbara, I think that she would say that a day of grace is a gift that comes from God. As people of faith, hopefully, one of our biggest priorities is to see life as a gift from God and to enjoy our life as a result of it. I won't read it again, but I think of our words for meditation today. They in part are saying the same thing. I don't know if Roger Housden, who composed the words, is a person of faith, but his words can be read through the lens of faith. His words can be seen as a call to see life as a gift from God, which we are to enjoy. I think it pleases God when we live this way, and if it pleases God, it's a good priority to have. Speaking of life as a gift, just yesterday I received one. It was in the form of words by Roman Catholic priest Richard Rohr. I hadn't planned on using them in today's sermon because I didn't discover them until yesterday, but because they seemed to fit with the sermon, I decided to add them. He says this: sink deeply into this world as it stands. Breathe in the smell of rain and the scuff of leaves as they scrape across driveways on windy nights. This is where life is. Not in some imaginary photoshopped dreamland. Here, now, you just as you are. Me just as I am. This world just as it is. This is the good stuff. This is the best stuff there is. Perfect has nothing on truly, completely, wide-eyed, open-souled present. I think of two other priorities that we are to have as followers of Jesus. Jesus called them the greatest commandments. Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, Jesus says. And then he says, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets, Jesus says. Now, we probably give more attention to the second commandment, loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, more than loving God. Loving our neighbor is certainly one of the very important calls that we have. By providing uniforms and school supplies for the children of Montclair Elementary, we are loving our neighbor. By providing lunches that will be delivered to Central Outreach and Advocacy Center, a longtime ministry of Central Presbyterian, for the homeless. We are loving our neighbor by doing that. There are countless ways that we can love our neighbor. It is our call as followers of Jesus. In the 4th chapter of 1 John in the Bible, we read that whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. So to love our neighbor is to love God. But by saying that the first commandment is to love God, Jesus seems to be saying that there is more to loving God than loving our neighbor, as important as Jesus said it was and as important as he lived it out to demonstrate it. How can we love God? Yes, by loving our neighbor, but also, as I implied earlier in the sermon, we can love God by living with gratitude for the gift of life. Gratitude is liberating and transforming. To go through our days with gratitude to God is a great way to live. It's one of the things that is at the root of joy, gratitude is. And all of us want joy. I believe that gratitude is one of the places that our treasure ought to be. Therefore, it ought to be a priority. You may have heard what Anne Lamott says about prayer. She says there are really only 2 prayers that we need. The first we can say when we awaken each morning. That prayer is, help me, help me. The other prayer is at the end of the day, thank you, thank you. That is to live with gratitude. In the wonderful book by Alice Walker, The Color Purple, that became a Broadway sensation, one of the characters, Shug, says this: I think it ticks God off. Actually, she says something else, but I can't say it in the sermon. You can guess what it is. I think it ticks God off if you walk by a field of purple flowers and don't notice it. To notice the beautiful field of flowers is to live with gratitude. The late, great preacher, Professor Fred Craddock, whom I often quote, makes it clear that one of our priorities as followers of Jesus ought to be gratitude. He once said that of all the virtues available to the Christian, the primary one is gratitude. He goes on to say, I have never known anyone who was grateful, who at the same time was small, sniping, bitter, judgmental, unloving. Gratitude, he says, just is it. I commend it to you.